Cities After is a bi-monthly podcast about the future of cities. Grounded in our daily urban struggles, it is part dystopian and part utopian. My intention is to entice your civic imagination into action, because we know that a more just and sustainable urban future is possible. This is Miguel Robles-Duran, and I dare you to imagine our cities after.
COVID, global warming, gentrification,
exploitation,
homelessness, racism,
colonialism,
patriarchy,
hunger,
police brutality,
religion,
Private property. Capitalism. This podcast is made possible by Democracy at Work. In today's podcast, I will continue to discuss post-pandemic urbanization trends by taking a deep dive in the speculative global rent markets and their exacerbating social ills. For help with this, I will be joined by Dr. Jaime Palomera from Barcelona's radical research cooperative, La Hidra, who will help focus a conversation on a striking report that they published 2 months ago titled The Social Impact of the Rental Market. This project was done in collaboration with the Public Health Agency of Barcelona and the Institute of Government and Public Policy at the University of Barcelona. La Hidra Cooperativa is a political enterprise dedicated to urban transformation for the right to the city. Over the years, it has exposed the corruption behind the public-private partnerships that have corroded urban democracy and popular sovereignty in Spain, and has been one of the key worldwide promoters of a radically different type of urban governance partnership, what they call a public-communitarian partnership. La Hidra Cooperativa is a key ally of the transnational consultancy Urban Front. Its members are Laia Forné, Mauro Castro, Ruben Martinez, and Jaime Palomera, who will be representing La Hidra Cooperativa in today's podcast. Dr. Jaime Palomera is an anthropologist with expertise on housing and urban change. He is co-founder of the think tank La Hidra Cooperativa and researcher at the Institute of Government and Public Policy of the University of Barcelona. Palomera is a member of the advisory board for the Barcelona Housing Observatory and director of the Political Economy of Housing program. He has done research on the political economy of Southern Europe, the dynamics of real estate and financial bubbles, the development of property and rental markets, the transformations of the construction sector, and urban inequality. He has provided policy reports for a variety of institutions, ranging from the European Research Council to the Barcelona City Council. Jaime, welcome to the show. It's really a pleasure to have you, and as representative of La Hidra and part of La Hidra, it's always been incredible to follow the work that you have been doing. Recently, you created a report that talks about rent in Catalonia, but more specifically in Barcelona. And I was quite taken by a point in which you start the report, which you say it discusses vulnerability, right? And the issue of how rent implies to be vulnerable, right? I wonder if you can talk at the beginning of the cast a little bit more about this finding of the report, but mostly about the issues of vulnerability in relation to that study.
Yeah, well, thank you, Miguel, for making this podcast possible and for inviting me on behalf of La Hidra. It's a real pleasure. This report has shown us things that we simply didn't have information about before. So it's shown us something that's quite striking. Usually when people think about the housing problem or the housing crisis, especially policymakers, also in the media, what they say is that the housing crisis affects the most vulnerable, that it's a problem of the poor. Housing is a problem of the poor. What this report, what this study shows is that, in fact, housing makes you vulnerable. Housing in the present condition, and especially the rental market, makes you vulnerable. It's not that because you are vulnerable, you have housing problems. This is also the case. But what we're saying is that the problem is really it cuts across class, race, gender, and we see that in the current conditions, not only in Barcelona, but at a global scale, the rental market is designed in a way that if you're a tenant, you are in a vulnerable and precarious position. Independently, like setting aside the issue of how much income you have or what your socioeconomic situation is. Because in fact, what we see is that the majority of people that have participated in this survey have higher education, they have pretty decent incomes. We're not talking about the most disadvantaged segments of the population. We're talking about common, ordinary people. And what we see is that they are all in a highly vulnerable situation because of the rental market and the current laws that regulate this market.
Yeah, no, I thought it was quite surprising to see that in the report, because even though there's a great number of people that are renting more, we don't tend to think of them, especially those of a middle class or a better economic position, as being vulnerable, right? And what this shows is that there is a very large percentage of the population, in this case in your report, around 80%, right, of the people that were what we call rent burden. And that's a very high number.
Yeah.
Right. Which also puts us to question, why isn't this a bigger issue? Why people don't talk about this more? And more importantly, why are not they organized, right? And in many ways, there's something that lets us believe that the rent that we pay is somehow part of our daily life and it's normal, right? But in reality, it takes a burden on most of society at the moment, right? So considering these, how do you see the organization that happens between people when they realize that they're paying a lot of rent? I mean, I know that you've been very involved in the production or the creation of a rent syndicate, which was like making people aware that they have these issues and somehow try to lobby or to fight against certain issues. Have you seen any mobilization that go around sort of like say, wait a second, we're 80%, rent burdened of the society? What kind of changes have you seen, or have you seen governments take into these, or is this something that is basically not talked about?
Well, in countries like Spain and in cities like Barcelona, it's a front page issue. So a lot of people are more and more. That's one thing actually that we see with this report, that more and more people access housing through the rental market. So the only way to have a home is to be a tenant. And not just more people, but for longer. So actually we're seeing now that in what we call the bigger Barcelona, or the metropolitan area of Barcelona, which involves many other municipalities, there's a majority of people up to 45 years old currently living in the rental market. So the majority of people below 45 years old are tenants. And the number of tenants is even higher among people below 34. More than 70% of people under 34, if they live they are tenants. And as you said, one of the most striking things is that, the EU and other international organizations talk about the question of the rate of overburden. So this rate, what it says is that if you spend more than 40% of your income on rent, then you are overburdened. It means that the minute that you lose your job or you have less income, then you're going to be in a crisis. But what this report shows is that, in fact, the situation is even worse than what we thought. What we use in this report is the concept of financial stress. And this is an indicator that allows us to see the situation of individuals, not households, but individuals in every household. And what we see is that, as you said, more than 80% of tenants are in a situation of what we call moderate or high financial stress. It means that more than 80% of the population are spending more than a third of their income, which is already more than what they should be spending on rent. But in fact, 1/3 of tenants are spending more than 50% of their income on rent. So the data is really shocking, it's worrying, it's very concerning. And again, I want to remind you that all of these people, like most of the people that responded to this survey, are not in a situation of they're not extremely poor. They are people with jobs. They're not in a situation of emergency. But what's been happening in the rental market, with prices skyrocketing, has pushed them to a situation of crisis.
Yeah, I mean, the way you put it, it's quite like burdening a whole generation, right? Or many generations, many younger generations, which is what it seems to be like the global trend. No, in the United States, for example, people always say that either you live with your parents or you're waiting for your parents to die so that you could actually have a more secure or stable sort of housing situation. And that seems to be the same condition here in Europe, definitely. Now, with that in mind, I mean, you have on one side the rent burden and the pricing on rent going higher and higher. But on the other hand, the incapacity of also reaching the mortgage markets, right? Because, of course, housing has been going up and up. Right, there's more luxury housing being built. There's much pressure from real estate developers. So in a way, we are like completely in a polar. The ones that can afford the house or not to be rent burden, you have to be like quite wealthy to be in that position. Right?
Exactly. And
I've heard that there's been quite a rise on housing prices here in Barcelona and in Spain. It has been quite rent burden, and prices have been quite up on a lot. How do you see the coming future of this scenario? I mean, we're going to continue to see this polarization between rents going higher and the price of housing for mortgages being even more? Or how are you perceiving this?
Well, in the current conjuncture with laws as they are now, with the current framework, not only in Spain but on a global scale, except for a few countries, what we're going to see is that prices are going to continue to go up. And in fact, what we're doing is that we're telling, as you said before, several generations that they're going to have to endure this situation with no end in sight. One of the most shocking results of this report, of this survey, is that over the last 5 years, people in the rental market, tenants, 65% of tenants have moved. But when we look closer, we see that actually half of these changes of apartment are the results of what we call an invisible eviction. Or in the US, we say, non-fault or non-cost eviction.
Yes.
So basically, your rental contract comes to an end, and you get a letter that says you either accept
the new
a
terms.
Price hike, the new terms, or you leave. And many people end up leaving. They don't consider themselves as being evicted. Many times we normalize and we naturalize these situations of violence, and we think, well, I'm leaving because I don't like the new terms. But the fact is that they're pushing you out, they're kicking you out. And what we see is that half of the people that moved from one home to another home over the last 5 years, they actually are victims, sometimes without knowing it, victims of an invisible eviction.
From being priced out, right? Yes.
Exactly, priced out. And in some cases, the law in Spain and many other countries allows not only to increase the price without limits, but also to just end the contract and kick a family out of their home with no justification, with no explanation. In several European countries, this is not the case. For instance, in France, the landlord, if they want to evict or they want to finish the contract and just kick out a family or a household, they have to give a reason. In Germany, it's even harder to actually displace somebody.
Yes.
You really need to provide a lot of reasons to end that kind of agreement, because there's a right to private property, but that right to private property is limited by the social function of property. And actually this aspect is present in many constitutions.
Yes.
In the Spanish constitution, it's also present, but currently the Spanish government is basically
prioritizing real estate.
Yes, exactly. Yeah. And it should be parliaments that defend the social function of the right to private property.
Yes.
But so we're seeing how currently, because rental markets have become fundamental business for not only financial capital, but also industrial capital all over the world, productive capital. We're seeing that capital. States, yes, and speculative capital, you've talked about this in previous conversations in your podcast. We're saying that states are adapting their laws to make to the interests of these actors, especially from the financial sector, who are driving this rise in prices. And what they're doing is they're basically protecting less and less tenants. And that's why what we're seeing now is that this study also shows this, that more than gentrification, what we're seeing is I don't know if this word is valid, but precarization, a growing precarity associated, as you said, a growing vulnerability associated to being a tenant. And what we're seeing a lot is that it's not that you are displaced and from your neighborhood or from your city. Many people, they just become nomads, not by choice, but because they're being forced to live like that, and they keep moving from apartment to apartment in the same barrio or in the
or
same
into
city.
The periphery, right? I mean, you move towards a neighborhood that is more affordable.
Exactly, but sometimes what I'm saying is that we see gentrification, but sometimes more than gentrification, what we see is that people move from house to house or from apartment to apartment in the same neighborhood because they are constantly pushed out of their home just because maybe the landlord is looking to raise the price. But sometimes that doesn't necessarily mean that they're going to raise the price. There's a lot of arbitrary decisions are made in the rental market because the law allows for landlords to do that, and sometimes these choices are irrational. They don't lead, like some of the homes, people are evicted, and then some of the homes, or a good part of the homes, remain empty for a long time without an increase, a clear increase in the price.
Yes.
So what we are seeing is that, in fact, sometimes the rental market does not even follow a rational choice kind of pattern. The thing is that we're saying that because of the current laws, a majority of people that are accessing the housing market for the first time or that have been living in the rental market for a long period are victims of very arbitrary abuses. And many times these abuses are irrational, even from the point of view of financial private equity investors.
Yes. Yeah.
Many of these apartments remain empty for a long time, and they're not even profitable assets for many of these investors. And this has to do with the fact that the law allows these kinds of actors to increase the price, evict tenants, or even harass them with no risk for them at all.
Sure. I mean, one thing that we began seeing, especially during the Bloomberg administration, but even before that, but there was an emphasis on, okay, so we have two kinds of housing, right? We have housing for those that have wealth, right? Which we know that's less and less people, according to statistics globally. And we have a housing for those that need some kind of subsidy or cheaper housing, right? In New York City, where I live, that's been a common pattern. I mean, you have a thing that is called affordable housing, which, as you say, there are certain laws that protect that your landlord cannot, evict you so easily, that your landlord cannot raise the price so easily of the rent. There's like certain limits that are put on a yearly basis that get decided by city council. And therefore, there's a number of people that tend to be protected to a certain extent, I say, and I don't think the protections go far enough, but there's a certain level of protection in the pricing. And that affordable housing can also be expensive. So I believe that many of the people in New York City are also rent burdened, even though they are living in what it is called an affordable housing. Now, we have that, and then we have the market price, right? Mm-hmm. However, going back to the first instances that you were talking about, the report, the affordable housing market only is occupied of people that earn money to a certain extent, which is, a low-income population, right? But now it's being argued that it's not only the low-income population that is in this. So you have a growing segment, let's say, of the middle class, exactly, right? That is not protected by anything, that is actually, left to the vultures of the market, right? And to be there. And there is no specific law that protects those people. No? I mean, if you have enough wealth, you go buy, right? If you need affordable housing and you are very low income, there might be some protections for you. But in that middle section, right, which we think is shrinking, there's nothing, right? Have you seen any advances on that front, or is that the thing that it continues?
Yeah. What we're seeing now is the consequence of having decided, our political elites and economic elites, of having decided over the last 40 years that public housing should be only for the really disadvantaged, as you said, and that the rest of the population would be able to access an affordable home through the market. In fact, the idea was that the market would be efficient and that it would, sort out everybody's situation. And what we are seeing now is the complete failure of that plan.
I agree.
We're seeing how not only the most disadvantaged are seeing how, are suffering the housing crisis, but also, an increasing part of the population. You said something that I really liked before, and the problem is that the market now only caters for the wealthy, really, for the better off. And in fact, in some cities like New York that you were talking about, we see how, you still have, we still have in New York like a 20% pretty regulated, public housing sector. In other cities around the world, across the globe, there's almost no public housing. Barcelona is a good example. In Barcelona, we see the survey, this report is very clear, that 97% of tenants are in the completely unregulated, non-regulated market, completely liberalized. So that's why actually we see these terrible social impacts, these figures that we were talking about before. So in cities like Barcelona and in other cities around the world, there is almost no public housing. Most of the population, most people have to go to the rental market, and also over the last 30 years, we've seen how rent control measures have been completely dismantled.
Yes.
But what's interesting also now is that I think we're seeing a reaction, a backlash to that. So, for instance, over the last 3 years, Germany has Well, Germany already in 2015 implemented a new rent control measure. Last year, Berlin went further with a more daring rent control measure. But we also have seen this in France. There's also rent control in France, a new form of rent control. Denmark, Holland, Ireland is going to do it. New York recently, improved
it always wants to expand.
Exactly, yes.
But yes.
And
yes.
now with Catalonia, Barcelona, we approved a rent control protection in 2020, September, 1 year ago.
Yes.
And this measure is currently protecting more than 5 million people. And of course, there's the threat by vulture funds, as private equity funds that are trying to already dismantle this very young form of rent control, very recent, through the Spanish state. It's always the state. You know how these kinds of actors, these financial funds, what they use is states to actually go against what cities and regions try to sometimes do, which is the case now in Barcelona, in order to put a limit to real estate speculation. But I see what we're seeing is that there is a backlash, not only in terms of price. We also in Barcelona we've seen a reaction to other forms of abuse in the rental market. Another figure, very very quickly, that we see in this report: 1 out of 2 tenants have suffered some form of, have been the victim of some kind of rogue landlord. What we see also in the rental market is that the phenomena or the reality that we call rogue landlords is actually much more widespread than what we thought. So the most common form of what we called housing harassment is, imagine you have a big problem in your home. You have mold, you have an infestation
of
termites.
Yeah. Or water seeping in,
leaking. Yeah.
Yes.
And you call your landlord or your, the middleman, the broker. You call them and you say, "Look, I have this problem. According to the law, this should be immediately repaired."
Yes.
Well, actually, almost half of these demands coming from tenants do not find response. So actually, this is a way of kicking people out of their place.
Of course.
And this is very widespread.
You get tired. You don't want to live there anymore.
Yeah.
And then
In Barcelona and in other places, this is called, it doesn't have an easy translation, housing harassment. It's a form of abuse. It's not that they are increasing the price immediately or that they're literally kicking you out, but they're making your home a hostile environment.
Yes.
Well, this is extremely widespread.
And then it adds up to this part also of the report where it comes out that people get their homes through a broker, right? So you're not even talking to the owner of the place most of the times, right? You are actually talking to some middleman that perhaps is getting paid for making your life a living hell so that you don't get the attention you need, as a broker. So that's also a tremendous complication that it's normally not taken by any law.
Yeah. Actually, this is very interesting, and we're also seeing this on a global scale. Very often, the fire sector, financial insurance, real estate sector, they insist that, that the rental market is actually, the rental market is not in the hands of these big vulture funds and banks, but it's sort of a mom and pop kind of business.
Yes.
So you have a lot of small landlords that make a decent.
That's what they've said income. Right now in the pandemic is like freeze rent, and everybody's like, what happens to your mom and pop thing? But the people that are complaining are precisely these big corporations. Yeah.
Exactly, and what they say, they use this narrative. If you put a limit to prices in the rental market, then this is going to have a very negative impact on all of these families that own a few apartments in the rental market. And what this report shows is that the reality is actually much more complicated. To begin with, as you said, the vast majority of apartments, of housing in the rental market is controlled by these brokers. Many of these brokers are big companies now.
Yes. And they're around the world, they're global.
Yes.
Yeah.
They're supposed also to be allegedly mom and pop businesses. Some of them obviously are, but many of them are big chains, and they have a very, very strong impact on the rental market. They, by default, work for landlords, even though they are allegedly middlemen.
Yes.
That should have a neutral position. They, by default, work for the landlord, and they have very often a negative impact on the rental market because they promote these abusive conditions. And in fact, they tend to have a volatile relation. So they look for the landlords, they try to manage the landlord property, then they find a tenant, and then they disappear. So they just they're short-term brokers, many of them.
Yes.
So actually,
because they work by commission, they do it, and that's it. Yeah.
They call themselves pirates. They say, we're pirates, and we're in it for the money, obviously,
Yes.
and short term. And this has a very negative impact because many of them are not following what the law says. Even the current law, which is in many places does not protect the tenant as they should. They don't follow these laws. They actually very often break the law, but the ones responsible for breaking the law are the landlords. Mm-hmm. So there is a sort of moral hazard, if you want, in the rental market. And then the other aspect of this survey that challenges the idea that the rental market is mostly a mom and pop business is that apparently a very large chunk of the rental market is in the hands of landlords that at least own 5 rental apartments. If you own 5 rental apartments in Barcelona, you're making a lot of money every month.
Everywhere, yes.
You're not somebody, as some have said, you're not somebody that is not gonna be able to put food on the table if if your tenant doesn't pay you the next month. Actually, you're in a very privileged situation. We see that half of the people that participated in this survey that know who their landlord is explain that the landlord owns at least 5 apartments. And then the other aspect, the other result that's very interesting is that many of the new landlords that had no presence in the rental market 10 years ago are financial actors. So 7% of these big landlords are private equity funds. Around 3% are banks. So we see that 10% of the new landlords, of the big not the new, just of the big landlords, are part of the financial sector, banks and financial funds and private equity funds. And even though this is a small proportion of the rental market, they are clearly a driving force of the current dynamics that we're seeing.
Yeah, and increasing their stake on it, because if something has been shown to us during the pandemic is that how a crisis can actually help the concentration of wealth in proportions that we've never seen before. In one of my podcasts, I talked about how many billionaires were made just in the year of the pandemic, right? More than ever, right? And so on. How wealth is increasing in the top 10% of the population around the world, and that as our friend David Harvey would say, when someone has money, they want to put it on real estate, right? It's seen as a very secure investment. And that is driving precisely that direction into the future, where if you had one apartment, if you own one apartment, if you rent, perhaps you have been concentrating more wealth, and it gets to a point you have 2 apartments and 3 apartments and 4 apartments and 5 apartments. So there is the possibility that in future direction, we have more concentration of properties in the hands of less people. So again, another point against this mom and pop type of scenario, that something needs to be done in the case where you own 2 or 3 properties that you rent. There has to be specific laws that apply to you as a landlord, right? And then that is not to say to vulture fund landlords that I know that in Spain you had a very big impact of organizations such as Blackstone. I mean, with Leilani Farha in a previous interview, we talked a bit about it. I mean, Leilani has been pushing sort of legislation against these vulture landlords, that just come and take. And with the pandemic, we've seen displacements. We've seen that people are not able to pay the rent because they lost their jobs. There are protections at the moment, but some say that they're just waiting there in the wire, just looking, until the moment the protections are over, where people need to pay the rent, and they won't be able to pay the rent, and then just take over as many apartments as possible. How has Spain dealt with issues as Blackstone, with corporations as Blackstones that buy thousands of houses and that are, left, by people that cannot pay them?
Well, like in many other places around the world, the Spanish state really put a red carpet for all of these kinds of actors. Yes. There was a big agreement it's called the Basel Agreements, where the main states and financial organizations of the world got together and said, okay, we've got a big crisis, financial crisis, and in order to fix this, banks are going to have to get rid of all the toxic assets, basically all of the housing that they acquired after all the evictions,
financial crisis,
after all the wave of evictions that they themselves generated. And they said, okay, the big banks have all these assets, you have to get rid of them, and we're going to make it extremely easy for all these private equity funds like Blackstone and others to acquire those assets and then actually turn them into a profitable business in the rental market. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I mean, this has been written about. Blackstone in 2008, 2009 started doing this in the US and said, okay, now we have to do this in Europe. There's a big business there. And actually Spain is going to be our point of entry. Spain became the laboratory for Blackstone and other funds. Yeah. And in fact, there was an agreement between people in the Republican Party and people in the Partido Popular, the right-wing party in Spain, to facilitate this with laws. First of all, taxes. These corporate landlords pay less taxes than any family,
Sure. As all of us might expect now, yeah.
Yeah, so it was very easy for them to buy these huge buildings all over the place, and then start renting them out without paying corporate tax. They're not paying also what we call transfer tax. So if you or me were to buy an apartment in Barcelona, for instance, we'd have to pay 10% tax. Mm-hmm. They don't pay this tax. Yes. It's just incredible. So they made it extremely easy, as you said before, for these funds to come and take these apartments. Yes. Much easier for than anybody else. And this has to do with a big agreement, the Basel Agreement, which was a response to the last crisis. And as David Harvey and others would say, it was a way of making the last crisis an opportunity for, a new source of profit. How to turn a crisis into an opportunity. The problem now is that although some of these corporate landlords thought of this as a short-term business, they realized after a while that it's become not a short-term, but at least a medium-term business. Blackstone the idea behind Blackstone's business was that they would buy, they would rent, and then they would sell, and this would take no more than 5 years. But now they've become the main landlords in many different countries.
They're the largest real estate holder in the world right now.
Exactly, and now they have to manage these properties. Yes. No other landlord in the world has the capacity to come now and buy these properties from them.
Yeah.
So, and it's not only Blackstone, you have Cerberus, very close to the Republican Party and the right-wing party in Spain. And you have Lone Star, you have many other companies.
They have just fixed capital, right?
Yes.
And they're trying to finance that fixed capital, yeah.
On the one hand, and on the other hand, there's no other actor with that kind of size in the financial market that's gonna be able to make it profitable for Blackstone and all the rest of it to sell all of those assets in a profitable way.
Considering this panorama, right, and let me summarize a bit what we've been talking about. There's obviously most of the population is incredibly rent burden, the one that rents. That younger population is the one that is able to rent, that it rents, because it's not able to buy. We have an exacerbation of more economic crisis during the pandemic. We have the concentrations of wealth on one side in this in the housing space, and more people are going to be, in the rental space more. No protections for middle class or anyone in the middle that does not fit into these spaces. And we have the vulture funds such as Lone Star, Blackstone, etc., right, trying to just grab more and more. How is the future? And I am asking you this in both directions. So one, it is very easy for us to see the future in a more dystopian scenario, which, yes, I want to continue to hear from you that scenario. If we don't do what will happen? Or what is happening? Or what will be even worse? And in your view, what are the things that need to be done immediately, right? We have an opportunity to change a lot of the directions because the pandemic has opened up a lot of spaces to change them. But at the same time, the pandemic has opened a lot of spaces for Blackstone, et cetera, to also change things.
Well, I have to say on this front that I'm more optimistic than it may have seemed until now in our conversation, especially, in light of the recent developments. On the one hand, states and transnational, supranational states like the EU are realizing that real estate speculation poses a threat to the real economy, to the productive economy. When you have a growing part of the population spending so much of their income on rent, that's a lot of money that doesn't go into the real economy. That has an impact on, from the bakery to the supermarkets to the cinema, to the theaters, or hotels all over the world. When people are spending most of their income on rents, they stopped doing many other things. And this is something that you don't have to be a radical leftist to realize this. It's people in the upper echelons of different states, EU, the US, that are realizing that this dynamic of global capitalism is posing a problem for the reproduction of capitalism itself. So that's why you see somebody like Macron in France, who's not a radical leftist, implementing rent control. And that's why there's a recent EU resolution saying that touristification of housing is a problem, financialization of housing is a problem, speculation in general is a problem, and actually prompting states and public administrations all over Europe to start thinking of ways to put an end to this and to at least try and limit all of these processes. So on the one hand, we have that realization on the part of political elites.
Yes.
And I think this is going to keep on growing. And then on the other hand, we have a social reaction in different places around the world. Cities like Berlin and Barcelona are organizing increasingly around the housing crisis. I think that one of the movements that has been growing relentlessly, steadily over the last 5 years is the housing movement.
Yes.
The creation of the tenants syndicate or the tenants union that you referred to before is a reflection of that. This organization didn't exist 4 years ago, and now it's a organization with thousands of members that has already managed to change several laws. It has, in Spain, it has managed to extend the duration of rental agreements. The minimum for a corporate landlord is now 7 years. Blackstone didn't like this.
Of course.
The previous government, the right-wing government, they made it very easy for Blackstone and other landlords to make 3-year contracts. And now, thanks to the housing movement, we have 7-year contracts. But also we have this new rent control in Barcelona, and now there's a huge fight. I mean, there's so much pressure of vulture funds on the Spanish state to stop this kind of rent control from spreading to other parts of Catalonia and Spain. Well, actually, already 61 cities in Catalonia have this form of rent control. By the way, it's a pretty ambitious rent control because it not only limits, it puts an end to hikes, to increases in prices, but it also makes it compulsory for landlords to decrease the price in new rental contracts if they are clearly above the average in their area. So it's close to what Berlin did very recently.
Yes.
And of course, this, the Spanish government has already taken this law to the Constitutional Court, a supposedly progressive government. Why? Well, it has to do with the enormous pressures on the government. A few days ago, Sanchez, the president of Spain, was in New York, and the first meeting that he had with it's part of a series of meetings with big companies in the US was with BlackRock and Blackstone.
Wow.
And
That
one of the
speaks
things
everything.
that transcended, that was become public, is that the president said to BlackRock, Blackstone, and others, is that they don't have to worry that Spain is not gonna approve a housing law that endangers their investments. So, I mean, it couldn't be more clear out in the open. But as I said, I think there is a growing movement, a counterpower in different parts of the world. In Berlin, there's going to be a referendum thanks to the campaign organized by the people of Berlin. There's going to be a referendum to decide if the city should expropriate all of the corporate landlords in Berlin and socialize all of that housing stock in the hands of these big landlords, based on the notion that all of these apartments are not fulfilling their social function. I think that 10 years ago, if you had asked me if I think that a referendum of that sort could take place anywhere in Europe, I would have said that's a bit
Yes.
It's a bit of a ambitious idea, very optimistic, and now it's become feasible. Of course, there's going to be a reaction on the part of the state. Already, people, in the federal German state have said that this goes against, the German constitution. There's a big debate. Again, interestingly, we have a clash not only between finance capital and the people, but also between the state and municipal governments, regional governments.
Yeah, which seems to be part of the direction we're going to see. I mean, the idea of municipalities fighting over, their citizen rights rather than, the state itself, because it's so embedded in this. Now, lastly, I wanted to ask you something. If we look in the next 5 years, for you, what would be your ultimate utopia, in a sense of you will be incredibly happy if this happens? I assume if the Berlin, passes this, etc. But like looking forward into beautiful imaginary.
Well, I think that first of all, we need to admit, all of us need to admit that the market is not going to solve the housing crisis. This has become very clear. But we have to admit that this is going to be the case not only for the truly disadvantaged, let's say, but for a majority of the people. And that if we continue, if we don't make a radical change, we're going to have a sort of two-tier kind of society, with the part of society being very privileged because they inherited properties, and a growing part of society as the disenfranchised, but a group of disenfranchised that is going to keep on growing, and as I said, that's going to be different than what we assume to be the disenfranchised until now. This is where we're headed towards right now, and I think that this is a future that none of us really can afford, because it's actually going to be detrimental not only for the people directly suffering, but for everybody, for society at large. Even any proponents of capitalism in its current form acknowledge that. So, and I think that the only way to really tackle this issue is to have a real public housing system. We have this in Europe. We have what we say in Europe is that we need to put housing at the level of education and health. In the US, of course, you could say at the level maybe of education, although in the case of the health system, actually, we're still longing. We're gonna need a lot of mobilization to make health a right for everybody, a universal right. In Europe, the so-called welfare states have two clear pillars. The health system and education. Any citizen is entitled to good quality, a high quality education, a high quality doctor health system. We should put housing at the same level, and it's actually, as it's extremely urgent to turn housing into a universal right for everybody. And I think that we need a program for that. We still don't have a program. I think that we have isolated attempts, initiatives to sort of, develop affordable housing for particular communities, particular specific segments of the population, but we don't have an overarching program to reverse the trend that we've seen over the last 40 years. But not so long ago, in the 20th, throughout the 20th century until the 1970s and 80s, many people defended that housing had to be a universal right, and that the way to ensure access to housing was public housing. And on the other hand, this is not it is utopian, but only partly. I think it's an available utopia.
Yes.
Vienna has its own problems. But in Vienna, we see how they're benefiting from a affordable, protected housing system that they've been developing for over a century. But still today, a lot of the housing that they produce is what they call limited profit housing. And that involves not only the administration, but it also involves private developers. Private developers, if they want to have any kind of profit, they need to develop housing for the people.
Yes.
Affordable housing with permanent rental contracts. This is not something that we are dreaming of. It's something that is already happening on the ground. Of course, as I said, Vienna has its own problems. I mean, prices in the rental market, the Vienna rental market are skyrocketing. Many people in Vienna argue that it's not enough what the administration is doing. But I think it gives us a hint of the direction we should be taking. And what they are doing, sometimes we are told to decide, do we want public housing or we want to intervene in the market? We have to do both. We need a strong public housing system, but we also need to intervene in the market, because market forces are making housing unaffordable at a global level for everybody.
Thank you very much, Jaime. It really, really was a wonderful conversation, and I hope to have you back in the next coming episodes to have more discussions.
Well, it would be a real pleasure. I feel that, this felt like a short talk, in fact, because we could be talking about this problem.
There's so many things I wanted to discuss, but we'll get into them. Thank you again, and thank you all. Thank you. Bye-bye. This was another episode of Cities After. Thank you for listening, and don't forget to subscribe.